What's up you guys, Gongrongzong here. So recently there's been quite a bit of debate about the loot. Macro Style came up with an entire video about it, right? The absolutely massive amounts of loot, of which 99.99% of it is useless, and we all spend more time walking up to a piece of loot and holding out our salvage button than actually picking it up. It just feels bad to continually go through tons of items with very little of it being remotely useful. But is it really that bad? Most looter games do inherently have very low drop rates for their most powerful items. It's common to do the math and come up with multiple decimal points for a rare item's drop rate. To start off, let's compare the Division 2 with the levels of RNG for the most famous item, arguably, in the gaming world in a looter game, the Stone of Jordan ring from Diablo 2. The rarest of the rare and the most powerful item of all, this ring still sells for a good $5 to $10 on the market, nearly 20 years since the launch of the game. Safe to say, it is extremely hard to obtain. Let's take a look at some stats of its drop rate. Taken from some crazy calculations of this post, all credit goes to this awesome author Igor Potapov. The Stone of Jordan's drop chance from one Nightmare Andariel kill is 0.047% for an 8-player game with 200% magic find and 0.062% with 500% magic find. So after about 1,500 runs, you'll have a 50% chance to find one Stone of Jordan. Oh, that is pretty low. Nightmare Andariel, if you're not familiar, is the first boss from what is, I'll say, the middle difficulty tier. She isn't difficult to farm for an endgame character, probably would take you an average of 5 minutes depending on how speedrunish your build is. But those are still some pretty low drop rates, and these are the drop rates for a multiplayer scenario where more items would inherently drop. If you're farming as a single player, the drop rate can fall as low as 0.025%, which is about half the multiplayer calculation. That equates to about roughly 4,000 runs in an ideal world for you to get a Stone of Jordan ring. And there's no guarantee, right? You may very well get it in the first run, or it may take 10,000 runs. But for simplicity's sake, let's say it's 4,000. That would be 20,000 minutes if each run takes 5 minutes, which is about 333 hours, about 14 days of total playtime. That's a long ass time. For those of you saying you've got about 300 to 400 hours played in the Division 2, imagine spending all of that playtime from the beginning when you very first started at level 1 to where you are right now, just doing mind-numbing Andariel runs, with no guarantee of the item dropping. And I'm pretty sure that if we examine any other looter games, we'll find similar numbers. But let's make a direct comparison to the Division 2. According to the calculations from both this awesome Reddit post and Macro's video, the chance of you getting an optimal item is about 1 in 75,000, which equates to a drop rate of 0.0013%. Okay, so a Stone of Jordan has almost 20 times higher a drop rate than an optimal item in the Division 2. That doesn't look good at all. That looks really bad actually. Really bad. But I mean, of course, this is an oversimplification, right? There are still other factors to consider, such as how long it actually takes to loot items. A low percentage means little if I can loot, say, 1,000,000 items an hour. So taking an average rate of about 5,000 items in 200 hours of playtime, for my own playthrough it's about 7,500 items in 320 hours, so about the same. It will effectively take you, as this post has also detailed out, about 3,000 hours of grinding. Okay, what the F? So a Stone of Jordan takes approximately 1/10 of the time it would take for you to loot an optimal high-end item? The most famous, rarest item takes 10 times less time to farm? That can't be right. No way that's right. Okay, let's try and take a step back again. There are still other factors to consider, right? For one, you don't need the most maximal of maximal roles to perform well in the Division 2. close to 90% of an optimal roll would already be considered best in slot, and you'll probably cut through enemies like butter if you were fully optimized on every single slot. If you inspect most of the speedrunners on the raid leaderboards, we can see that very few of them actually have the most optimal rolls that can be theoretically attained. They're about 80 to 90% there, but definitely nowhere close to min-max. In addition, these drop rates of 0.0013% in the Division 2 are based on a single gear slot, the backpack slot, the gear slot with the most number of variables other than the chest piece. For your other pieces that have way fewer variables, like the holster, gloves, and knee pads, obtaining your BIS piece is actually pretty feasible in a relatively short amount of time. It's definitely not out of our reach to get a holster with 15.5% crit chance or damage, gloves with 12% specific weapon damage, or knee pads with 8.5 to 9% crit hit chance, for example. I myself have quite a few of them already. So is it really that bad? It is definitely bad, and urgent changes are definitely warranted. But I just wanted to put out there that it's not as insane as we all first thought on first impression. Standalone, the drop rates are very low, yes, but only for 2 gear slots. So rather than just focusing on the numbers alone, I think we have to qualify it with some of the other factors before making a proper judgment. And that segues nicely to the next point. Standalone, the RNG isn't end of the world bad, but when coupled with horrendous complementary systems like the recalibration table, God knows who even designed that, and the exceedingly small stash space, the problem of already very low RNG becomes severely magnified. The current design philosophy of gear and re-rolling gear, which is to keep as many pieces as you can in anticipation that something better may or may not drop within the next few months, is frustrating as hell when combined with a stash space that simply cannot accommodate the sheer quantity of items that we all have to constantly keep. Massive is advocating a hoarder mentality with their loot design, which isn't necessarily good or bad on its own. But you cannot have a hoarder type loot structure with an inventory system that is intentionally limiting. These two things are direct opposites, oil and water. They do not go together, and it only results in increasing player frustration. If the recalibration table was based on talents and attributes that we could save within the table itself, rather than having to keep a ton of actual items in anticipation of using them down the line, a huge burden would be immediately lifted off our shoulders in having to play this mini-game of inventory management every time we log on. It's gotten so bad that it's often way more efficient to be farming things solo, because of the sheer amount of time spent waiting for other players to sort out their loot just after a few events. But to give credit where credit is due, Massive were on the right mentality by giving out loot so generously. They definitely wanted to make sure that players felt rewarded for their efforts. This was one of the main praise points during the open beta. As many of us have experienced firsthand from Anthem, it definitely does feel good to have high-level loot drop, and often. Also, remember when we first all saw the Borderlands 3 trailer? We were going, whoa, hell yeah, all the loot explosions.
The vault's opening! It's time for a loot explosion!
But the drawback of such an approach is, the more loot you drop for the player, the less meaningful each piece of loot becomes. The sight of a high-end item in the Division 2 now spells probably useless in our heads, rather than, ooh, a yellow drop, sweet. If too many good items drop too quickly, the grind for the loot isn't fulfilling any longer, everyone gets their BIS pieces relatively quickly, and the game goes stale. On the other hand, if good items are too few and far between, causing us to have to pray to RNGs every time we boot up the game, the player base gets burnt out and frustrated, and the game also goes stale. It's definitely not an easy job to undertake, and I don't envy the devs for the task that they have to do to carry out in finding the perfect balance. But make no mistake, They are definitely at fault for this current loot system and for the player base that is currently speaking out in droves, being extremely dissatisfied with the current state of the endgame. There are many examples for them to look at, such as Anthem for what not to do, and Diablo 3 after the 2.0 loot update as to what to do. There's no excuse here for the problems of RNG that currently exists. They could have added in a currency system that was actually useful. In Path of Exile, you can trade your items with other players in exchange for certain types of farmable currency. In Diablo 3, you can constantly re-roll your legendaries so that you can eventually get them to be best in slot. The end goal may still be very far away, but at least we as players can always see the light at the end of the tunnel with such systems. Right now, the loot tunnel in The Division 2 is bleak and dark as hell, a goal that is simply not able to be practically worked towards because it is entirely RNG dependent. And so, yes, it really is that bad, but not just singularly because of low drop rates. No, low drop rates on their own are manageable, but a deadly trifecta that has to be looked into and improved as soon as possible. A combination of high levels of RNG, a terribly clunky inventory system that causes item management to be an absolute chore, and a recalibration table that is frankly extremely rudimentary at best and downright baffling at worst. A whole hodgepodge of factors that often make the hunt for loot in the endgame a discouraging experience.